Hello, and welcome to Episode 3 of the White Harvest Podcast Beyond the Pulpit series. Our passage today is Luke chapter 1, verses 18 to 25, and I'll read that for us in its entirety before we start to dissect it. Zechariah said to the angel, "How shall I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in years." And the angel answered him, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. And behold, you will be silent and unable to speak until the day that these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time." And the people were waiting for Zechariah, and they were wondering at his delay in the temple. And when he came out, he was unable to speak to them, and they realized that he had seen a vision in the temple. And he kept making signs to them and remained mute. And when his time of service was ended, he went to his house. After these days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she kept herself hidden, saying, "Thus Yahweh has done for me in the days when he looked on me, to take away my reproach among people." So let's begin at verse 18. Zechariah said to the angel, "According to what shall I know this? For I am old, and so is my wife." Or literally, my wife is advanced in her days. So the first thing that some people might notice is that Zechariah is punished for asking this question. And they might ask, why was he punished when other people in the scriptures weren't for asking the same or very similar questions? As a prime example, just 16 verses later, Mary asks what appears to be the very same question. In verse 34 of Luke 1, Mary asks the angel Gabriel, "How will this be, since I have not had sex?" Or literally, "since I do not know a man." Why does Gabriel punish Zechariah, but not Mary? Well, the short answer is that Zechariah asks his question out of doubt, while Mary asks hers out of believing astonishment. The argument isn't entirely a grammatical one, but the grammar in both of their questions illustrates the point. Zechariah's question begins in verse 18 with 2 Greek words, katati, meaning something along the lines of, according to whom, according to what, by what standard. Mary's question in verse 34, by contrast, starts with the single Greek word pos, simply meaning how. Zechariah is not necessarily telling the angel that he's wrong, but he's skeptical that what he's been told will actually happen, because he knows how basic human biology works. "My wife and I are both old," he says. And he knows full well that, under normal circumstances, that renders the chances of Elizabeth becoming pregnant at 0. This is a good time to chase a rabbit that Darrell Bach mentions in his commentary on the Gospel of Luke regarding the intelligence of ancient people. There's a common notion among skeptics and anti-supernaturalists today that because ancient peoples did not possess today's technology and all of the learning possibilities that entails, that they were all gullible, uneducated rubes who would accept at face value any outlandish story that you told them. This is an example of what C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery, the arrogant belief that you are intellectually superior to someone just because you live after they did, you possess technology that they didn't, and you have been influenced by a post-Enlightenment emphasis on naturalism, rationalism, and empiricism. Just earlier this week, I was listening to a 1993 debate between Greg Bahnsen and Edward Tabash on the question, "Does God exist?" And in the entire 2.5-hour debate, the skeptic, Tabash, basically only made 2 arguments. Number 1, I don't like the biblical God's morality. And number 2, the Bible isn't trustworthy because it was written a long time ago. This arrogant dismissal of all things ancient is alive and well in the modern non-Christian world. While it's outside the scope of this podcast episode to jump down this particular rabbit hole, I will simply deny the modern assumption, and I emphasize that last word, the assumption that the ancients were rubes just because they didn't have iPhones. In fact, I would make quite the opposite assertion. If you consult the primary sources from the ancient world and account for the technological differential between us, I would argue that the ancients were proportionately far more intelligent and industrious than we are. Paradoxically, the conveniences and endless possibilities of modern technology have made us comparatively lazy and unambitious in the quest for knowledge. I've had the privilege of meeting a few scholars who've massively enhanced our understanding of knowledge in the ancient world. For example, John Steele on ancient Babylonian astronomy, John Wee on ancient Mesopotamian and Greco-Roman medicine and anatomy, Theo Vandenhout on Hittite scribal culture, and of course the endless amount that could be said about the architectural marvels from across the entire ancient world. On and on we could go. Although none of these scholars are Christians, as far as I know, they would all readily acknowledge, I think, the genius of ancient man, all factors considered. Bringing us back to Luke chapter 1, the point I'm making is that the ancient Israelites were not morons just because they acknowledged the supernatural and lived before the invention of the microscope. Zechariah is a smart man. He knows how babies are made, and he knows that there comes a time when couples are no longer able to produce children. He knows that both he and his wife are past their expiration date. From a naturalist perspective, his question is a valid one. We're told in the next verse, though, that his doubt is supernaturally unwarranted. Verse 19. The angel answered him, I am Gabriel, who stands before God. I was sent to tell you this evangelion, this good report. We find out from this verse, and verse 20 after it, that Zechariah's response was inappropriate, an irony, considering that his name means Yahweh remembers. Not only does he have scriptural precedent of God's miraculous enabling of conception in the past, such as in the cases of Abraham and Sarah in Genesis 15 to 21, as well as Elkanah and Hannah in 1 Samuel 1 and 2. But the presence of this supernatural creature right in front of him should be all the assurance that he needs. The angel's first phrase of self-identification, I am Gabriel, has a bit of a sarcastic edge to it that's a little more plainly seen in the original language. Biblical Greek possesses a few features that English doesn't, such that word order is much freer in Greek, and the same basic idea can be conveyed in multiple different ways with subtly different emphases and shades of meaning. When Zechariah says in verse 18, I am old, he essentially says it in the verbal equivalent of bold typeface. He wants to make sure the angel knows that he and his wife are biologically incapable of producing children anymore. When Gabriel responds in verse 19, I am Gabriel, he mirrors Zechariah's emphatic word order almost exactly, as if to sarcastically respond, so what? He is, after all, one of the highest-ranking beings in the heavenly hierarchy, because his responsibilities include standing beside God's throne to hear all of his plans and to announce them accordingly. Interestingly, the only explicit Old Testament appearances of Gabriel were in the book of Daniel, chapters 8 and 9. And in those contexts, his purpose was to explain the apocalyptic visions that Daniel was seeing. Isn't it interesting, then, that Gabriel, the one who explained to Daniel the timetable of the Messiah's arrival in Daniel 9, verses 24 to 27, is the very same one whom, 5 centuries later, God sends to announce to Zechariah the fulfillment of that very timetable in the births of John the Baptist and Jesus of Nazareth. The fact that he's an apocalyptic angel also has implications for the intended effects of Jesus' life and ministry. In other words, the incarnation of Jesus the Messiah marked the end of the former covenant era and the beginning of the messianic era, what in biblical language is called the last days. There's a common misconception in American evangelical circles that the biblical phrase last days, or the Hebrew yomim acharim, refers to a very small amount of time in the far distant future from the New Testament, right before a rapid-fire series of world-ending events that includes a supposed rapture, 7-year Great Tribulation, etc. If we're careful to observe how the biblical authors use the phrase, though, we'll notice that they use it very differently than we tend to. Take, for instance, one of the more prominent examples in Acts chapter 2, after the Holy Spirit has descended upon the disciples during Pentecost, enabling them to speak all the languages of the gathered nations. And Peter speaks to the bewildered crowd beginning in verse 14. Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and declared to them, "Judean men, and all those who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and pay attention to my words. For these men are not drunk, as you assume, because it is 9 o'clock in the morning. But this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. It will be in the last days, God says, I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh, and your sons and daughters will prophesy, and your young men will see visions, your old men will dream dreams, etc., etc." Notice very carefully that Peter says that Joel's quote-unquote last days prophecy has been fulfilled right there at Pentecost, mere weeks after Jesus' resurrection, and some 2,000 years in the past from us. How can this be? Well, it's quite simple, actually. When we seek to understand terms as the biblical audience did, rather than imposing our own meaning onto it. To the ancient Jewish ear, the phrase Yomim Acharim, last days, was not some secret code for a short period of time right before a season of global disaster that was meant to engender panic. Rather, it was a reference to the entire Messianic era, the entire Messianic age. Jesus' death and resurrection marked the end of the former covenant age and the beginning of a new one, wherein King Jesus has authority over all of heaven and earth. And we, in fulfilling the Great Commission, take part in his mission to take the world back from the forces of darkness and bring all the nations of the earth to worship the one true God of Israel. We have been living in the quote-unquote last days, that is, the Messianic era, since the days of the New Testament, and we will continue to do so until Jesus returns. Bringing us back to Luke chapter 1, it is thus highly significant that Gabriel is selected out of all the angels in heaven to announce the births of John the Baptist and Jesus to Zechariah and Mary, respectively, given his reputation as the bringer of apocalyptic, game-changing news. And indeed, he lives up to his reputation, because this revelation from heaven, the first in 400 years, signals the beginning of the last days, the Messianic age. It's also interesting to note, in the final clause of verse 19, that the language of announcing good news references the ancient use of heralds or messengers. In the ancient Near East, they didn't have telephones, of course, so whenever someone, usually a king, needed to convey important news to someone else quickly, they had messengers on their payroll whose sole purpose was to run as fast as possible and bring messages, whether good or bad news, from one party to another. You can see an example of this in action in 2 Samuel 18. As Amy Jill Levine has noted, these evangelia, these messenger reports, could range from military victories to governmental tax relief measures to even simple proclamations of the emperor's birthday to the public. But given the context of this passage, I would say that the more militaristic flavor is the intended one, namely, that Gabriel brings a good news message from the very throne room of heaven that the long-awaited Messianic King is about to arrive. Moving on to verse 20, the angel Gabriel says, "Behold, you, Zechariah, as a consequence of your disbelief, will be silent and unable to speak until the day that these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time." The word behind this phrase, unable to speak, in broader Greco-Roman literature, could refer to either muteness, deafness, or both simultaneously. In the case of Zechariah, it appears that he is struck both mute and deaf, given that not only does he have to make signs to the people outside in verse 22, but as we also see later in verse 62, other people have to make signs back at him in return. God's punishment, however, is what Sheldon Vanauken called a severe mercy, in that this deaf muteness is only temporary, and that, as we shall see later in verse 64 and the following, Zechariah's emergence from this period of chastisement at the birth and naming of his son is cause for praise and song on his part. Verse 21. The people were waiting for Zechariah and began to wonder when he was delayed in the temple. The Talmud, Masechet Yoma, chapter 5, tells us that the incense offering didn't take very long, and that the priests generally didn't overstay their welcome. They knew very well from stories like the unauthorized fire of Nadav and Avihu in Leviticus 10 that the presence of Yahweh was nothing to be trifled with. So they would generally fulfill their duties and offer quick prayers for the peace of Israel before scurrying outside. The fact that Zechariah appears to be taking his time is cause for concern to the crowd outside. They might be thinking to themselves something like, has Zechariah said or done something to offend God's procedural commands? And is he now lying dead on the floor of the temple? But no, verse 22 tells us he is not. Eventually he comes outside, and the people realize that something's wrong because he can't speak the Aaronic blessing of Numbers 6 verses 24 to 26 to them, as is customary for the priest in his position, per the Talmud Masechet Tamid 7:2. By the way, as a small side note, you might have noticed over the past couple of podcast episodes, I've quoted several times from the Talmud, which is this absolutely massive collection of post-New Testament rabbinical laws and later commentary thereupon. And when I say massive, I mean Orthodox Jewish people today have a daily Talmud reading plan called the Daf Yomi, in which you read 1 page of Talmud every single day, and it takes approximately 7.5 years to read through the whole thing. Now, the reason that I'm quoting from the Talmud so heavily, at least for now, is because since verse 5, the Gospel of Luke has been in a highly cultic context, which is scholar speak for saying that it primarily takes place in the Jerusalem temple. So a lot of the details in the text concern the worship rituals therein. Unfortunately, the scriptures themselves don't give us a whole lot of detail about what a day in the life of a Levitical priest looked like. The Talmud can help fill in some of those details, and I emphasize the word some because we do have to be careful about accepting everything that it says at face value from a historical perspective. The Talmud did not reach its completed written form as we have it until about 500 years after Jesus. And much of the material that it contains does indeed come from too late a date to be of any historical analytical value. Some of the teachings written in it, however, reflect oral traditions whose roots can be traced back several centuries back into the late Second Temple Jewish period when the New Testament took place. Thus, as long as we're being careful and judicious about the source of our information, we can potentially gain some helpful insight into New Testament passages that deal heavily with the Jerusalem temple, such as the passage under our examination today. Having made that clarifying remark, however, and returning to verse 22, Zechariah finally comes outside, and people realize that something extraordinary must have happened, because the fully able-bodied priest who went into the temple just a little while ago has come back out and is now both mute and deaf. Verse 23 tells us that he served out the rest of his week-long term of service at the temple and then went back home to his wife. Interesting, isn't it, that Zechariah didn't just immediately go home after this extraordinary event. We aren't told how far into his week of service he was when Gabriel spoke to him, so we can't say for sure whether he served 6 more days, just 1, or however many in between. But however long it was, can you imagine what must have been going through his mind as he went about his priestly duties for the remainder of his term, largely shut off from the world around him? Something to ponder. Verse 24 tells us that after he went home, sure enough, Gabriel's message proved reliable, because old, barren Elizabeth miraculously conceived, and she secluded herself for 5 months. We can't say for sure why Elizabeth secluded herself for 5 months, because there doesn't seem to be any prescription or precedent for that in the Old Testament, Second Temple Jewish literature, the Talmud, or any other relevant source. The best guess that scholars have been able to offer at this point is that Elizabeth wanted to wait until her pregnancy was undeniably obvious before she started telling people the good news. If you put yourself in her shoes for a moment, it makes sense. In a cultural context where childlessness is assumed to be a curse from God, she has had to put up with a lifetime of needless ridicule from those around her. On an emotional level, she's probably tired of listening to it. And on a theological level, she might want to keep her neighbors from blaspheming God by denying the message that had been sent to her husband. So perhaps, before she begins to share the good news of a son, and a son who fulfills the Elijah forerunner motif no less, perhaps she wants to wait until her friends and neighbors are forced to take her at her word. Finally, in verse 25, Elizabeth expresses herself, offering one of numerous outbursts of praise that we find here in the first couple chapters of Luke. Verse 25, "Thus Yahweh has done for me in the days when he concerned himself with me," literally looked upon me, "to take away my disgrace among people." There's not a whole lot of additional background commentary that I can make here that hasn't already been covered. And honestly, I don't know if I could express it any more beautifully than she did. So we'll end today's episode on that high note. May Yahweh bless and protect you. May his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May he lift his face toward you and give you peace.
You have been listening to the Beyond the Pulpit podcast with Pastor Garrett Skirbina. For more information, go to foothillscommunitychurch.org.